Thank you.
Alrighty, well, welcome everybody. This session is introducing Project Explorer, which is a new relatively new VFPX project. It came out last year. For those of you who don't know me, and there are a few I think on the line here, my name is Doug Hennig. I'm a partner with Stonefield Software. I've written a bunch of tools over the years, including Stonefield Database Toolkit and Stonefield Query, which is our sort of our flagship product. I've also written a number of tools that come with Visual FoxPro, including the member data editor and the anchor editor. I wrote a couple of the tools that are in Sedna, and I updated the upsizing. So I didn't author from scratch. Written over 100 articles in Fox Talk, Advisor, and Fox Rocks magazines. Co-author of several books, the latest one being VFPX Open Source Treasure, available from the German FoxPro user group. I'm one of the organizers of Southwest Fox, and I'm one of the administrators of VFPX. I was a Microsoft MVP for 15 years, and in 2006, I was given the FoxPro Community Lifetime Achievement Award. So we're going to talk about a sort of a replacement for the FoxPro Project Manager, and I'll explain what I mean by sort of in a moment. One of the issues that I've always had with the FoxPro Project Manager is that there's a number of things that it doesn't do very well, or at all. One of the things is that you can't filter or organize items other than by the way that the project manager itself wants to do them. You know, it organizes them by classes and documents and programs and so on. But that's really the only organization mechanism that's available, and there's no filtering or things like that. So why would that be an issue? Well, let me show you. This is the main project for Stonefield Query. As you can see, there are tons of class libraries, and of course each one has tons of classes, so there's a lot of stuff in here. If you look at the code page, for example, there's tons of stuff in here. So the thing is that typically I work, like I'm sure many of you, I typically work on maybe 10 different M's, because a lot of these things were written years ago. They work fine, no need to touch them. There's maybe, 10 different classes and 5 different PRGs that I work with on a regular basis. Well, of course, the problem is I have to scroll down through this big list and find them. I have to scroll down through this big list and find the one I want to change. It would be really nice if I could organize these and say, I only want to see the classes, these 5 classes or these 10 classes that I work with regularly, and filter that list down. And like I said, unfortunately, there's just no way to do that. It only works with one project. Stonefield Query actually consists of 10 different projects that have to be built. So I have to open the first one and build it, and open the second one and build it. And I don't actually do that. I actually have a PRG that automates that. But you get the idea that you have to build all of these projects independently. One of the bigger issues, though, is that there's no support for newer version control systems, sometimes referred to as distributed version control systems. There is support for things like SourceSafe and Vault, the older style, but there isn't for the style that I think more VFP developers are adopting these days, like Git and Mercurial. There's just no visual support or pretty much any other kind of support within the project manager. So last year I decided that I sort of had enough of dealing with these limitations and wanted to create a replacement. But it's not exactly a replacement for Project Manager. The reason I say it is because behind the scenes, the Project Explorer actually does use the Project Manager. So when you open a project in Project Explorer, it opens the Project Manager, but just with the no-show clause, so you don't actually see it. It's still back there, and that way we can take advantage of the features of the Project Manager, and we can take advantage of project hooks. It just doesn't show visibly. So let's first of all talk about how you get and install Project Explorer. There's 3 different ways you can do it. One is you can clone it from Git if you happen to use Git. So let's go and find my browser window here. If you go to vfpx.org, that's sort of the starting point for VFPX. And if we go to the projects page and scroll down, you'll find Project Explorer. So if you click on that, that takes you to the GitHub repository, or you can go to this directly, github.com/DougHennig/Project Explorer. Either way, you get to this page where all the source code is located. So what you can do is you can choose to clone it. So if you copy this URL, and then we can go and create a choose Git clone and paste that URL in here, then it will create, it'll clone that GitHub repository onto your machine, and then you can have it and work with it and so on. A simpler mechanism is to just download the zip. So if you click on this button, then click on download zip, that will download the source code for Project Explorer to your machine. A third way that you can do it is if you launch VFP. Let me go and do that. Come on, where is it? There we go. If we launch VFP, you can get at it through Thor. Now, I'm not going to do it because it takes like a minute or so. But if you're using Thor, if you choose Thor, can check for updates. You will see Project Explorer in the list, and then you can download it that way as well. So those are the three different ways. Let's go back to my show here. Those are the three different ways that you can install Project Explorer. It doesn't have to go in any particular folder. Really, it's not important at all where you put it. So let's spend some time taking a look at Project Explorer. We'll talk about how you start it. We'll take a peek at the user interface and all the different controls, talk about managing items, building projects, version control, and other kinds of functionality. So there are several ways that you can launch it. Oops, let me go back to this window here first. I'm just going to copy and paste some text here. So there are several different ways that you can launch it. One is you can say do and then the folder and then projectexplorer.app. So that will open up a dialog asking you to locate a solution, which we don't have yet, or a project. So I'm going to choose a project and we'll open up the demo one project. Okay, so that's one way that you can launch it. Another way that you can launch it, is by specifying the name of a project. So you can say with demo1.pjx. And that pretty much does the same thing. You can also specify a solution using a complete path. Now I'm sitting in a folder that has one now because it just got created when I opened up that project. So I can specify a path to a solution, and then it'll open it that way. The way that I actually use it, though, is I've got it installed in Thor. So in Thor Tools, Applications, you can see Project Explorer. I just configured. I went to the Thor Configure tool, and I added Project Explorer to the menu here. And I've got a hotkey assigned to it, Control-Alt-P. So that means I just hit Control-Alt-P, and it opens up. And because I'm sitting in a folder that has a solution, it automatically opens up that solution, so I don't have to pick one. So let's go and take a look at the user interface now. You'll notice that it closely, at least these files here kind of closely resemble what you see in the project manager. We see, the proper icons for a class library, the icons for each different class in the class library. You'll notice immediately some differences, though. The first thing you'll probably notice is that there are no tabs across the top. Instead of having tabs for the different types of objects, there is this combo box. Saves a bit of real estate, but more importantly, this combo box is actually data driven, as we'll talk about later on. So you can actually customize this list here and control what you see. You'll also notice that rather than having a bunch of big text buttons down the right-hand side, there are some image buttons across the top. Saves a bit of real estate. Also at the bottom, there isn't a section where you can see the description of the currently selected thing and so on. So that saves a bit of real estate there as well. So it kind of has a little more compacted appearance. It also, I think, has a more modern appearance. The project manager is 25 years old now, so or 20 years old, I guess. So this, I think, has a little bit more modern appearance. Another thing that the menu is right here within the window, as opposed to having to go up to the Fox Pro menu bar. The menu is actually located right here within the window, so it's kind of always at hand, which is no big deal way I've got it positioned here. But if I've got it way down here, obviously it's a lot easier to just do this than to go all the way up to the menu, click the item, and then come back again. Also, it's maybe kind of hard to see here, but this is actually a desktop window. So I can actually and you won't be able to see this because you can only see this one monitor, but I can position this outside my Fox Pro window, which is actually the way that I normally run it, because that way I have the entire Fox Pro window available for editing and other tools, and I have the Project Explorer sitting on my second monitor altogether. So I just find that a lot more convenient, saves a lot of space. You can also dock this window as well. So if you want to dock it, say, with the command window or left, right, top, bottom, that kind of thing, that works as well. Let's go and add another project here. So I'm going to click on the menu bar button or the menu button and add a project to this solution. And you'll notice that we now have 2 projects in this solution. This is the reason I call this a solution, is because Visual Studio has a solution explorer. The idea being that a solution is one or more projects. So as I mentioned earlier, Stonefield Query consists of 10 projects. So I've got 10 different projects built in my Stonefield Query solution, and I can build them all as a group with one, with one mouse click. I can build all 10 projects at once. So that's all, it's handy to have all these things in one place. Let's go take a look at, now, one of the things you may think is, well, I'm kind of missing that description information at the bottom of the window. It's actually all there. It's just kind of collapsed, like I said, to save some screen real estate. If I pick this VCX and then if I expand the window, this button here expands the window, and now we see information about my selected item. And we actually see a lot more information than what we have in the project manager. In addition to just seeing the name and the description, we can also see, for example, the path to the VCX. We can see when it was last modified. You may or may not be aware of this, but the Fox Pro PJX file is actually a DBF file with a different name. It's a table, and it has a user memo field, but that's not exposed anywhere, so you can't get at it through the project manager. Project Explorer does expose it, so it's right here. You can put in whatever values you want there. Project Explorer doesn't use it, but you might use it for various tools that you create. So let's take a look at each of the properties here. We've got the name, obviously. If you want to rename it, you simply type a new name in here and then click on Save. It will go and rename that object then. We have the path. You can choose to display the path either as a relative path, relative to the location of the project, or as a full path. That's just an option. If we go bring up the menu and go into the options dialog, I can just turn on display full path for project files, and now we see the full path. So you can control what you see, whether you have the full path or just the relative path. Also, you notice that there's a link for the path. If I click this, this opens up your Windows File Explorer and takes you to the folder that file exists in. So that's kind of a handy little utility. Last modified, we mentioned. You can choose to exclude the file, or you can turn on main file for those files that support that. You can change the description. You can change the user memo. We'll talk about tags and categories later on. If you make any changes, you can either save or revert them back to the original. If we take a look at a class, we see, again, some more things, some of the things we saw before, but also for a class, you can see the parent class and what library that's contained in and what the base class is. So all this information that you don't see in the project manager. You can also see the include file, and again, this has a link. If you click it, and that include file is included in the project, which doesn't have to be, but if it is, it'll automatically take you to the other tab and select that include file. So you could then go and modify it right away, for example. Now, I want to go back to what I was looking at, so I could just, do this and choose classes, but there's also a back button here in the toolbar. So if I click this, that takes me back to the thing that I was looking at before. And actually, it's sort of stack-based. So you can go back and back and back. And in fact, there's even a little drop-down menu here. You can see all the things that I've actually navigated through. And I could go back to any level here. I can go to this object here, for example, just by choosing that. Just like there was with path, there's and the include file, there's also, if it's not a Fox Pro base class, there's also a link on the class and library. So if I click on class, it'll take me to my parent class, or if I click on library, it'll take me to the library that my parent class belongs to. Ole Public is here. You can change the icon or the toolbar icon, and then we have the rest of the same things here as well. if we choose a form, then there are a couple of additional properties here. We have the class the form is of, and the library it belongs to, and again, we have the include file. So like I said, although it doesn't show you these things when it's in its collapsed state, so it sort of shows less information, I suppose, than the project manager does. But once you've expanded it, you see a lot more information than there's available. And if we take a look at a project, there's actually, you'd have to bring up multiple modal dialogues to see all the things that we see here. Here are all the project settings that we have, and like I said, normally you'd have to, when you have the project manager open, you'd have to go and choose project info from the project menu to be able to see these things, but now they're all available right here. So everything we see on this tab are the project settings. Everything that we see here are build settings. So you'd have to click on the build button, then you'd have to click on version button to get the settings here. And you, like I said, you can edit these things right away. And in the case of a project that builds to a COM server, you have the server tab here that shows you all the same settings that we had in the servers tab. So like I said, these settings you'd have to get at a couple of different modal dialogues to be able to see these things. So let's go back to my classes tab here. And let's talk about a couple of other things that I said we talk about later, tags and categories. Tags, if I click on this, you can see that this contains the things that you typically see as tabs in the project manager. We have classes, code, data, documents, and other. However, this is actually a data-driven list. So let's go up to the menu and choose Tag Editor. So here are the tags that come with Project Explorer out of the box. And these are, you'll notice that the remove button is disabled, the edit button, the edit box is disabled. You can't change these. Well, you sort of could if you went into the table that I'll talk about in a minute. But by default, you don't change these because these are the sort of the core ones that you see in the project manager. However, we can go and add a new tag. So we'll call this one, for example, framework. Maybe I want to tag all my framework classes. You know, if you're using something like Visual Fox Express or Visual Max Frame Professional or something like that, you might want to tag the classes that are part of the framework, especially from the ones that are specific for your application. So now that I've got this new tag, I could go in and tag those things that are part of my framework. Like let's say, for example, this class is part of my framework. You notice that these are checkboxes, so we can check multiple items. So I can have, this is both belongs to the classes tag and it also belongs to framework. And we'll save that, and maybe we'll do it for another one here as well. And maybe we'll do it for the VCX too. So now, if I go up to my tag drop-down list, we can choose framework. Remember, I said this is data-driven, so it shows all of your tags. And now we only see those things that have framework as the tag. So this is a really easy way to filter your classes, your PRGs, your documents, and so on, so that you only see those, for example, that are framework. Or maybe you want to have one for things that are specific to your project, or maybe you have certain classes that you modify on a regular basis. So you can create a tag for those things and then tag those classes and then filter them down. Now we do have a question here. A couple questions here. At some point, you'll cover the version numbering feature of the project manager. I wasn't planning on that. We're not doing anything different with that. Can I ask a question on major minor version? Sure. Like I said, we're not doing it. It's not doing anything different than the Foxware project manager is doing. Yeah, go ahead and ask, and I'll carry on. But once your question shows up, then I'll answer it. So those are tags. The idea of a tag is that you can, like I said, you can define which category essentially these things belong to. Now there's another thing though called category. So let's take a look at here, and you can see that these are different colors. And I actually took the inspiration here from Outlook. So these are sort of the same set of color schemes that you see when you want to categorize mail items or to-do items with categories. But as you might expect, we do have a category editor. So we can go in and change the name that belongs with a particular thing. So for example, we could change red to maybe incomplete. And maybe we'll change blue to untested. Now, if you don't like those colors, you can also change the colors. So for example, maybe for green, I do want it to be green, but I don't want it to be a fore color of green. I want the back color to be green. So we can make the fore color, say, white, and we can make the back color green. And we'll tell that we want to display the back color, not the fore color. So what is the difference between fore color and back color? I'll show you that in a moment. So now that we've got a few categories changed, now let's go and display the full classes. Now we can go and change a few things, like say, for example, my SF custom class. I've been working on it a lot and it's not done yet. So I could categorize it as incomplete. And when I do that, you'll notice that the foreground color changes to red because that's what incomplete means. And for edit box, maybe I'll say that this one we're done developing it, but it hasn't been tested yet. So I'll flag that was untested. And again, it might be a little bit hard to see because the contrast isn't that different between black and blue, but it is showing with a blue text. And let's say that this one, we'll call this one just green. And you'll notice that there is the difference between the background and foreground. In this case, it's going to be the background color that's green and the foreground color is white. So it maybe stands out a little bit better. So coming back to Patrick's question, 2018 major, minor 1608 and 001. Yes, you can use those numbers as your. I'm not sure what the limit is. I think it's in the VFP help file what the limits of the numbers are. I'm not sure off the top of my head what they are.
Well, Doug, is a way to really know when you compiled it. The trouble is mine won't go to the next day for me. It's just the first day I open the project, it starts incrementing the numbers. But imagine if you actually had a real number, not one. You'd have the number. It'd be a cool way to know exactly what day it was. Every day you compiled it, you could re-update major, minor. You always know what that number wouldn't be cryptic.
Yep, absolutely. I'm going to show you how to do that later on. Near the end, when we talk about add-ins, we'll be doing that. All right, so what's the difference then between categories and tags? Well, tags show up in here, and category shows up in here. It basically just is a way of color coding your classes. I mean, you can distinguish the difference between those yourself, whatever way you want. The way that I distinguish them is that a tag is sort of what a class or an item is. You know, it is a framework, it is a class, it is a program, and so on. Whereas a category is sort of more of a temporary thing. Like right now it's untested or it's incomplete, but then later on, once I've finished completing this thing, I'm going to change it back to none, which you could change the wording of to done, complete, or whatever you want to. And then so I'll change that back again. So that's the way that I work, is I treat category as a temporary thing, whereas tag is what the thing is. That's, you know, and that doesn't change, obviously. Now, in addition to choosing from the tag drop-down list as a way of filtering out items, there's actually another mechanism as well, and that's through filtering. So you can either go up to the menu and choose sort and filter, or you can do it right here from the toolbar. And you have a couple, and the reason it's called sort and filter is because it's both sort and filter. By default, it's sorted in descending order, in ascending order by name, but there's a couple of other choices here. You can choose category, and then ascending or descending order, and now it'll be sorted so that my categorized items are at the bottom because it's in ascending order. Or another one that's really useful is last modified date in descending order. So now, for example, we can see that SF form, I changed it yesterday when I was preparing for the session, and this one, well, not this one. This one I haven't changed since 17th of May, and then this one since, Halloween last year, and so on. So obviously, the ones that are at the top of the list are ones that I've been working on recently, because those are the ones that I'm more likely to keep on working on because, you know, maybe I made a mistake or put in a bug or things like that. So Richard made a comment, I use category as a workflow manager, which is kind of a cool idea. I hadn't thought about that. So that is kind of a cool idea there. So in addition to sorting, you can also filter here. If you click on this button, this brings up the FoxPro expression builder, so you can do whatever you want to there. Now, the filter is going to be any FoxPro expression, but typically you're going to filter on some property or some property of an item being some value. Well, how do you know what the properties are? That's what this list here is for. So for example, let's say we only want to see those items that were changed in the last week or so. So if we scroll down a bit here, we can see last modified. That's probably the one we want. So we can choose that and click insert. It simply puts that into the filter log. Then we can say greater than or equal to date -7. Oops, I hit cancel. I meant to hit OK. So let's go back and do that again. Oops, last modified. One more time.
3 times the charm.
I'm hoping. There we go. Okay, is greater than or equal to date -7, and click very carefully on count. Okay, and so now we only see those items where the last modified date is, a week ago, up to a week ago. And by the way, as we hover over here, you can see what the filter is and what the sort is. So we have all kinds of different properties you can choose from here. Things like can edit, can include. You can also choose save or load. A couple of people suggested this as issues, and so I added this recently. Let's go ahead and load an existing filter that I have. And so here, item base class equals checkbox. And so now we see those items that are based on checkboxes. We can see all of them that way. To clear the filter, you can either go in here and sort of wipe this out, or the fast way is if you just right-click on that, that resets the filter and the sort back to the default. Now let's talk about managing some items. One thing I'm going to do, though, is that if I go and modify this, say this class here, you'll notice that because this has desktop set to true, it's going to be on top of everything, which is kind of a pain because even when I click on this, this is always on top. So because I normally work with this window outside the FoxPro window, it's not a problem for me, but obviously it is when I'm doing my demo here where I need to be able to work in this sort of restricted space. So if you bring up the options dialog, you actually have 3 choices for window type: desktop, which is the one I normally use; dockable, which means it can be docked to, say, the command window or to an edge of the form. I'm just choose neither, and let's just close and reopen. And now you can see the window looks a little bit different. Now it's sort of more like a regular FoxPro window. And so when I go and modify a class now, I don't have that issue about this being on top all the time. So let's talk about the different choices of things here. So modify, obviously, is for modifying a class or a program or whatever. This actually extends beyond some other things, though. Pretty much everything can be modified except for an FLL. So for example, we even have support for images. So if I go here and click on modify, it launches my default program for modifying images, which happens to be Paint, but you could specify something else instead. We also have special support for the VCX itself. If you modify that, either by double clicking it or clicking on the modify button, it launches the class browser, which is pretty much the same thing that the project manager does. You actually have a choice about whether what happens when you double click. That's controlled through the options dialog. Project double click action, run selected file, or modify selected file. These are actually the same options that you find in the FoxPro tools options dialog. And in fact, we write them to the same registry location. So if you change it there, you'll actually see that changed here, or vice versa. If I change it here, I would see it changed in the FoxPro project manager in the options there as well. The run button will run something. In the case of a program, obviously, it's gonna run that PRG. In the case of data, like for example, a table, the tooltip actually changes and displays as browse, so it does the same thing. It's not exactly a run, obviously, but it's more like a browse. Interestingly, you can even run a class. So let's run, say, this SF form. Let's go and run that. And it actually instantiates it, right? So kind of kind of a handy little thing to be able to do there with certain types of classes. In the case of a class like, say, a checkbox, it actually just instantiates on the desktop, which, you know, is more or less useful, I guess. The new button will work for most things as well, but there's a special dialog for classes. Let's go and show you for a PRG first. So if I click on new, unlike the FoxPro project manager though, where it creates a new program and then you specify the name when you save it, we ask for the name first. And the reason for that is because we actually have hooks into when you close the thing you're editing, as I'll talk about later on. So that's why we need to know the name first before you start saving it. As I mentioned, there is a cool behavior for new when you're sitting on a class. If I go and choose this form, for example, and choose new, it brings up a dialog similar to the FoxPro new class dialog, but there are more choices, and these are actually thanks to Mike Potcher for suggesting these, because this makes it really, really useful now. So, because by default, it's going to assume that what you want to base the class on is the thing you had chosen. In the FoxPro Project Explorer or Project Manager, it's kind of a pain, right? Doesn't matter if I'm sitting on a class or not. If I click on New, it brings up the new class dialog, and then I have to go and click on the button, navigate all the way through my folder hierarchy to find the VCX that I was already sitting on. Then from the drop-down list, choose the class that I want. Well, here, these are already filled in for you. It already fills in the VCX, and it has chosen the class for me. So it's really, I find this a really cool feature. It's just a matter of selecting a class, clicking on New, and putting in the name, and then clicking on OK. So no navigating around. Now, that being said, if I just happen to be sitting on this class, but that's really not what I wanted. I wanted to create something from scratch. Then in that case, for example, I can choose blank, and then I can create a FoxPro-based class. I wouldn't, but I could. You'll also notice that this is an MRU list here, for example. So the most recent 10 classes that I've subclassed from. So for example, I could choose this project hook VCX, and then I get the classes that are in there. Or I could choose this COM server and then get the classes that are in there, and so on. So, and they're actually shown in descending order by most frequently used, by last used. So because the last thing I subclassed was in SF controls, that one appears on top. If I pick a different one this time, then that one would appear on top, and it shows, like I said, the last 10. Of course, you can specify a different VCX to store it in. And also another idea that Mike specified was sometimes, most of the time, you're going to want a subclass, but sometimes you just want to do a copy, right? So instead of dragging from a VCX from one VCX to another to make a copy, you can actually do it this way, just by picking the VCX and then turning on copy, specifying a name, and then choosing OK. So that's a very cool option. So somebody asked, can you change what editor is used? And the answer there is yes. And we'll talk about add-ins later on. So you can control what add-in or what editor is used, for example. The add button does what you expect. It goes and adds an existing file to your project. The remove button will remove just about most things. And it removes it from your project. And if it's a file, then it asks you if you, just like the FoxPro Project Manager, asks if you want to remove and delete. The build button, if you click on the build button, it displays a dialog similar to what we have in the FoxPro Project Manager, where you can choose your action type. You'll notice that there isn't a button for version information. That's because that's already there in the Project Manager, so there's no need for that. Now, one really nice thing here, though, is that it remembers your settings on a project-by-project basis. The FoxPro Project Manager just uses whatever settings you used last time. So if you build a project to an EXE, then you build another project to a COM server, then you go back to the first project. When you click on build, it's going to have COM server chosen, and you have to change it to EXE. This remembers. So, and it also remembers this. One of the things in the FoxPro Project Manager is that when you click on the build button, you click on OK, it then brings up another dialog asking you for the name of the EXE or app to build. We actually have that right here, so it doesn't go and do that. It just goes and does the build right away. So let's build this project to an EXE. Let's build this project to a COM DLL. I'm going to get an error message because I'm not running as administrator. That's fine. It still does the build. But now if I go back to the first one and click on the build button again, you notice it remembers that that's an EXE. and it remembers that that is a COM-DLL. So, and I can also, you notice there's a little drop-down button here beside this. If I click on this button, then I can actually build the project without seeing the dialog, just using the settings, or I can build the solution, which means build all the projects in the solution. So when I choose this, it builds this to EXE, it builds this to a DLL, gives me the warning again, because I'm not running as administrator, but that's okay. So it goes in and builds all of the projects in that solution. All right, let's talk about version control. So under the menu here, I'm going to choose version control properties. I'm going to tell it that the solution uses version control, and then you can pick which version control provider. There are two listed right now that I've created classes for, Mercurial and Git. If you're using something else like Subversion, then feel free to create your own subclass of the class I'll show you later on, implement its behavior, and then you can, then you can use Subversion. So I'm just going to choose Mercurial here. You then choose what goes in the repository for binary files. Obviously, text files are going to be in the repository, but for binary files, you have a choice. You can put binary files only, so it will not create text equivalents of them. You can tell it text equivalents, no binary files, meaning that it will use Fox bin to PRG, or which is the default, or some other binary to text program of your choice to create the text equivalent of a binary file, and the text equivalents are the ones that are in the repository, not the binary files. So the repository would not have VCXs or FRXs or SCXs. It would only have the text equivalents of those. Or you can choose both. So you can choose whichever you want there. I'm going to choose text equivalents only. We'll talk about automatically committing changes later on, so we'll just leave those two alone and choose OK. Now, because I may have started using Project Explorer with an already existing project and that's already under source control, in that case, of course, Project Explorer doesn't know that it's already under source control, so it asks me now, do you want to create a repository? Like, are you just putting this thing under source control now for the first time? In which case I would say yes. If I already have been working under source control, I would say no, and it'll just go and find the repository automatically. If it can't, then it'll ask you to locate it. But it assumes that it's .hg in the current directory if it's Mercurial, or .git if it's Git. So I'm going to tell it yes, I do want it to create a repository for me because this solution has not been under source control before. So it's actually going to go and create the repository, and now it's going to go and create text equivalents. This flashing that we're seeing here is actually Fox bin to PRG, as it creates text equivalents for all of my binary files. So my VCXs, my PJX, obviously, my VCXs, my SCXs, my FRXs, LBXs, and so on. And you'll notice now that the icons that are displayed in, not for classes, but for files, the icons that are displayed for files now show you the proper image for its version control status. So because these things were freshly added to the repository but haven't been committed yet, they show with a little plus sign. So I can now go, I can right click and choose commit all, and then I'll use my traditional message for an initial commit, which is initial commit, and OK. And it goes and does the commits. It actually redoes the binary to the text to a binary to text conversion again. And now we see our little green check boxes. So like Ghostbusters say, light is green, trap is clean. So we know that everything has been committed. There are no changes to any of these files. Let's go and change a PRG. Let's modify this. And it's not really cool. It's just sort of cool. So I'll take out the word really. And you'll notice that the icon changes. When I save it, the icon changes to a little red exclamation mark, indicating that there are changes to this program. I can now right-click and choose Commit File, or I could choose Commit All, but let's just commit the file. We'll say Changed Wording. And it turns green again because it has now been committed to the repository. Let's go and change the description for this program. This is a program, like that isn't already obvious. And let's save that. And notice where the red exclamation mark appears. It doesn't appear on the program, it appears on the project. Why? Because the description of a program is not stored in a program. And same thing for for a VCX and so on. The description belongs in the project itself, right? So it knows that it was the project that was changed, not the program. Now, what happens if we revert? So let's just right click and choose revert. And let's revert that change. Let's go back to that and notice the description is gone, right? Because we reverted the change to the project, which got rid of the description that we had changed. Just checking for any questions here. No new questions. Now, one thing that I don't use personally, because I like to have control over the commits, but I decided that to build it in just because it was easy to do and just in case you might want to use it, is the ability to do auto commits. So, so when you turn on automatically commit changes, it'll do just that. So when you change a PRG, as soon as you close that PRG, it not only saves it, but it also commits it to the repository as well. And so there are some things that it won't, it'll ask you for a commit message if it's a modification. There are some things that you can specify what the messages are because it'll automatically use these. Like when a file is added to the project, we don't ask you for a commit message. It'll just use whatever message you specified here. Same thing for when a file is removed. When it does the commit, this is what the message will be and so on. So different messages for different kinds of things. So now, for example, if I go and modify my program, this really is a cool application after all. So let's save that. And you'll notice it asks me for a commit message. And we do not get a red icon because it saved the change and committed it automatically. So that way the repository, every time you make a change, the repository is updated. Like I said, I don't use that personally. I prefer to see the little red icons and then do the commits myself, but whatever mechanism that you want. We do have a comment or question here. My version control was incremental on compile only. Your thoughts, since I have to alpha test exe before QA perform their tests on the exe. Yeah, like I said, I don't use, commits are one of those things that if you're using a distributed version control system, there really is no penalty whatsoever for doing frequent commits. So some people really do believe that you commit after every change, because if you don't like the change that you made, you can always revert to an earlier version. So a commit to the repository is sort of like a step up from a normal change, right? You're just making sure that it's always around, it's always going to be there, and you can get back to it at any time. So, like I said, different philosophies on committing. I tend to commit after small atomic changes. And when I say atomic change, it isn't necessarily a change to a single file. It might be a change to a couple of files, but it's for one reason. I'm fixing a bug, but the bug appears in two different places. The source of the bug is two different things. Or maybe I'm adding a new feature, so it's 3 different files that have to change. So once I've finished adding that new feature and in all 3 places, then I would go and do the commit. But again, different people have different ways of working. So. All right, some of the other features that we have, there is a shortcut menu, as we saw a couple of times already. Some of the other features or functions that are in here are exclude, set main. So rather than having to go and click on this, have this dialog expand, let's collapse it again, having to expand the dialog and then find the right file, and then turn on exclude or set main, you can actually just right click it and do it right here. We can modify or run it from the shortcut menu. Builder just brings up the project builder, just like it would in the project manager. Refresh refreshes the solution. So if I made some change to say a TXT or to one of my text files outside of Project Explorer, this simply refreshes the tree view and rebuilds it. Build solution is just rather than having to click on the button in the toolbar. Add file to version control or remove file from version control. These do just what they suggest. You may, for example, have a file in your project that although the project is under version control and most files are in it, maybe for some reason one file doesn't belong in version control. So in that case, you can remove it. Convert binary to text. Let's go and choose a text file, or a binary file, I should say. So convert binary to text and convert text to binary does exactly what it describes. The idea here is that, obviously when you change a class, we automatically, let's go and do that, for example. Let's go, oops. Yes, I do remember that. If I go and change a class here, let's go and change the date, for example, and save that. You'll notice, and oh, that's right. Sorry, I got an auto commit here. Let's cancel the commit. Let's go and turn off auto commits, because I want to show that it got changed. So let's go and change the date again and save it. And you'll notice that the Foxbid to PRG window pops up. So every time you make a change to a binary file, Project Explorer automatically regenerates the text file for it. And you can see that we have our little red icon here indicating that it was changed. Now, for some reason, some things that doesn't happen automatically. Like, for example, if I go and add a record to a table here, this didn't automatically get converted to the binary DBF file. It wasn't automatically updated as the DB2 equivalent. If I change the structure, it would be, but just adding a record or editing the contents doesn't do that. But if this is one of the files that, say, is included in the project and is part of my repository, then I probably do want to update the text equivalent. So I could just right click and choose convert binary to text, which would do just that. Alternatively, if I had done a merge, for example, let's say that I and somebody else were both working on this application, and they made a change to one of the classes in this VCX, committed it to the repository, pushed it to the repository. I did a pull, I did a merge. Now the text equivalent has been changed, so I need to regenerate the VCX from it. So in that case, I could choose convert text to binary. So it would go and take my text file that has the merge changes and update regenerate the VCX from it. Commit file, commit all, revert. We talked about those earlier. Revision history is kind of cool. Let's go and take a look at the revision history here. Where did the window go? Here it is. All right, so here is my revision history. Let's make this a little more reasonably sized. There we go. So here is the revision history for this VCX. Actually, it's the VC2 file, remember, because the VC2 file is the one that's in the repository, not the VCX. But the benefit of that is I can actually read this text down here as opposed to looking at a binary file. One that gets used all the time, obviously, is visual diff. What differences are there between the original and the current version? And we can see here that I edited the date from 2009 to 2018, which again we can do because this is the text equivalent, not the binary file. And the other option here is to bring up the repository browser so that I could do things like, let's bring this back over here, so I could do things like doing a pull, doing a push, and so on. So those are all the menus that are available, or menu items that are available in the shortcut menu. Let's take a look at the options that are available in the drop-down menu here. So open solution does just that. It would go and open a different solution so that I could start working with that. Add project to solution, we used that earlier to add demo 2 to our existing solution, or we could remove it. Cleanup solution just basically does a pack on the project and all the binary files inside of it, so similar to the cleanup option in Project Manager. Version control properties we already saw, sort and filter we already saw. Assign tags to items is sort of a fast way of assigning tags to multiple items at the same time. It kind of looks like the sort dialog, but this is because we have to filter to indicate which items we want. Like, let's say, for example, we want to assign the framework tag to anything, because my classes all are SF something for Stonefield. For all my base class, for all my framework classes, I might say that, for example, the item name equals, or left item name, comma 2 equals SF. So that would, if I click OK, I won't, but if I click OK, this would automatically assign the framework tag to any item starting with an SF. So sort of a fast way, rather than having to go to here, edit it, change the tag. Go to this one, change the tag. Go to this one, change the tag, and so Tag editor and category editor we already looked at. Options, so in addition to some of the things we've already seen, you can specify what the default version control provider is. So if you happen to use Git rather than Mercurial, you can choose that, and that way whenever you add version control to a project, Git would be chosen by default instead. These two items are actually the same as they are in the project, in the tools options dialog, the FoxPro tools options dialog, whether files are added to the version control when added to the project automatically, and whether files are removed from version control when they're removed from the project automatically. And so you can control that. We already talked about window type. Display user-defined class icons. Let's turn this on. And then let's right-click and choose refresh here. And you'll notice that a different icon appears for SF checkbox. That's because this actually has a custom icon assigned to it. So that way it appears differently in the project manager than just a regular old checkbox item does. So you can control whether those are displayed or not. You probably want it turned on because otherwise there'd be no point in assigning an icon to a project item if you weren't displaying them, right? We already talked about displaying the full path. Visible splitter, I like to have this splitter appear this way, but some people like to sort of have it more visible, you know, with the button with the dots and so on. I didn't mention earlier that there is a splitter. This is a resizable dialog, and the splitter here controls the relative sizes of the tree view and the other part of it. I prefer to have it sort of be a little bit more subtle, so I turn that off, and then it appears like that. Add in debug mode, you really don't want to turn this on unless you really have to. The reason is because we'll talk about add-ins in a couple minutes, but if you have add-in debug mode turned on, then this pops up all the time. It pops up a message box as add-ins are being loaded, as they're being fired, and so on. So that's why it's called debug mode, because it tries to help you to see when add-ins are being fired. So, but if you have it turned on, then you're going to see it firing a lot, even though you don't want to. So make sure you leave that off mostly. Add a new allow any file type. So if I go and click on, let's go to code here, for example. If I click on new, you'll notice that my only choice is either a PRG or an FXP. If I click on add, right? Those are the only choices I have. So it only displays PRGs to me. So that kind of makes sense, right? I'm sitting on the code tab, or if I'm sitting on forms, for example, and I go and add, I can only choose another form. However, some people want to be able to choose any kind of file, regardless of what they're sitting on in Project Explorer. So if you turn on add and new allow any file type, then when you click on add, now the default is form, but you can choose any file type, and then it'll simply add it to the correct place. You know, it'll add it if you choose a DVC instead of a form, it'll add it to the correct tag automatically. And the last one is remove unused headers. Let me go to the here. We can see, for example, that we see forms, reports, and labels, because I do have some reports and I do have some labels. But for this project, I only see forms because it doesn't have a report or label in it. This is also noticeable when I go to data. For example, we can see tables, remote views, local views, connections, stored procedures in this database. In this database, I only see tables. I don't see headings for remote views or local views or connections or stored procedures because there aren't any. That's because I have this remove unused headers turned on. So that way it just, and you can see by the tooltip that's what it's doing there. So the idea is it makes the tree view shorter, right? We don't have headings with nothing under them. We only have category headings like that if there is something under them. All right, some other behavior. We support drag and drop from File Explorer. So let's go and drag this text file. I'm just going to go and drag this to the tree view control. And so it adds it to the project. We can see by the little plus sign here, and it automatically added it to the right tag, and it automatically flipped the tree view to showing us other. Even though we were sitting on classes, because it was added, and I wanted to show you that it got added to the right place, and so we switch our view here automatically. You can also drag a class from one VCX to another. So if we take, say, this SF spinner and simply drag and drop it onto here. So it works just like the project manager does, right? No difference there. Same thing for if I go and modify a form. I can actually, let's go and collapse this for a second, and let's choose a class. I can actually drag a checkbox and drop it on the form. So that works like you'd expect it to. It has special support if you add it to a grid, though. So if you have a grid column selected, when you drag and drop, say, a checkbox to the grid column, it pops up a little dialog and asks you whether you want to replace the default text box with the new control that you've added. If you say yes, it'll do just that. It will delete the text box that was there by default, and it will make the checkbox the new default control there.
Yay!
Yay! And one last stupid pet trick is that you can actually drag and drop a class onto the desktop. Oops, there we go. And so even though it did show me the sort of the international no symbol I was dropping, but it did actually instantiate. So I don't know that you'd actually do this, but because it was easy to do, I thought, what the hell? Like a lot of the things that I decide to do. All right, so let's go and talk about some of the features of the project manager that I did not implement. Tearing off tabs. There are no tabs, so you can't tear off something you don't have. Shrinking the window to just show tabs. I actually never use either of these two features in the Foxborough Project Manager, and since we don't have tabs at all anyway, they're not supported in Project Explorer. I also found the files page of the project information dialog to be completely useless because it just shows a list of files. Well, yeah, I can see those in the tree view, so why do I need them here? So I didn't implement that. If somebody, thinks there's a good reason for it, let me know, and I can always add it, but I just couldn't think of a good reason for it. So same thing with the code page in the shortcut menu. Didn't add that. Could, but I just didn't. And save as in the project manager really just saves the project to another PJX file. I never found a use for that either, so I didn't implement. Again, could, if somebody gives me a good use case for it, I'd be happy to do it, but haven't found one yet, so I didn't bother. All right, so now let's talk about, so we've gone through now the user interface and the behavior of Project Explorer. We'll spend not a lot of time, I just want to give you an orientation for the guts of it, how it works, how it's implemented, and so on. First thing I'll mention is that underscore screen has a collection because you can have more than one Project Explorer open at a time. So it has an O Project Explorers collection. And the key to the collection is the current folder because you can only have one solution per folder. The key is the directory name. So if you do underscore screen.o project explorers c:\projects/my app, that would give you an object reference to the Project Explorer. And what can you do with that? Well, you could do a bunch of different things with it if you're so inclined. Here's a tiny little program, for example, that this one just assumes that there's only one, so it doesn't use a key. It just gets the first item from the collection. But then it goes through the Project Explorer, has a solution member that we'll talk about in a moment. That's obviously the solution itself. And the solution has a collection of projects because a solution can be more than one project. So for each project in the projects, then let's go, and the project, as again we'll talk about in a moment or so, has an O project items collection. Those would be all the items that are in that project, like all of the classes, all the PRGs, and so on. And as a collection, it has a count. So basically, this is just going to go through all the projects in the solution and add up all of the number of items that we have and display it. So if I run this, it tells me there are a total of 74. So there are 74 things, not files, because these aren't necessarily all files, like every class counts as well. But there are 74 things, items in this solution. So let's talk about the different files that make up the project. So in the Project Explorer folder, itself. Obviously, here's the PJX and PJT files that make up the app file. That's Project Explorer itself. These files here get created if they don't already exist. These are where the categories are defined. So when you go and use the category editor, they're actually stored in this table. These where the tags are defined in this table here. This file here has some settings, sort of some global settings. So it tells me that I've got two different version control providers, one for Mercurial, one for Git. This is the class and the VCX where I can find that code, and it knows that the default repository folder is named .hg for Mercurial and .git for Git. If you want to add support for Subversion, you'll create a subclass of one of the classes that we'll talk about in a minute, and you'll add a record to this XML file that tells it about Subversion, which specifies the class and the library. Same thing here is where we specify what text converter is used. If you don't want to use FoxBin to PRG, and I can't think of why you wouldn't, because it's a great tool, but if you want to use SCC text or SCC text X, or if you want to use Christoph's Fox to Fox, you can specify that here. So you specify, again, what class implements the behavior and what library that's contained in, and the path of where the PRG or whatever is going to be doing that thing is located. So you can specify something other than FoxBin to PRG if you want to. Again, I can't think of a good reason to do so, but there it is. If you take a look at your project folder, so this is the folder we've been working in, we'll notice that there are some additional files in here, these underscore metadata. So there's a demo1._metadata, DBF, FPT, and CDX, and a demo2. These are the metadata settings for each project. That's where, for each item, the category and tag is defined. So that way it knows that, my SF checkbox is in the framework category, and it uses untested as its the framework tag, and uses untested as its category. Those settings are stored in these metadata files. So there's actually only two changes. Actually, one other thing is the solution itself. So this XML file is where the solution is defined. And you can see here's how it knows that demo1 gets built to an EXE and demo2 gets built to a multi-threaded DLL. And it has the other project build settings and the output file name. So the project build settings are stored here in the solution file. So it knows that there are two projects and what the build settings are for each of them. It also knows that we're using Mercurial. If there was no version control, this entry wouldn't be here, or it'd have blank values. But because it's here, it knows that it's under version control and that it's using Mercurial, and that it's using this for conversions and so on. So it's got all the, and it knows where the repository is, and sort of all the other settings for that, the automatic build messages and so on, or the automatic commit messages and so on, are all stored in that solution file. So Project Explorer makes just one change to the PJX. I decided that I didn't really want to touch the PJX very much. So that's why, rather than storing this metadata inside the project file, I stored them in separate tables. So there's really only one change that's made to the PJX, and that is in the dev info memo field. If you ever looked if you ever opened the project file as a table and browsed it, you'll see there's a dev info memo field in there, and it's only used for one record, the header record for the project itself, and that's where things like your build set, your project settings, your company name and your author name and so on are stored in that record. The rest of them aren't being used, and so I decided, because I need to have a primary key for each item, the name isn't good enough, because even though in a given project I might only have one VCX, I might have more than one project open in my solution, and I might have the same VCX or even a different named VCX but in a different folder in the same solution. So the name and path wasn't good enough to use as a primary key. So I used that dev info column in the project file, storing a sys 2015 value as the key for each item. And so that's written to the PJX file. The other thing that might be written to the PJX file is if you change the description of an item, or if you put in a user value for an item, those are going to get written to the file as well. But the project manager does that as well. So that's not exactly a difference from the project manager. The one difference, like I said, is that dev info column. Other than that, we don't touch your project file directly. All right, so now let's go and take a look at Project Explorer from a source code point of view. Project Explorer is the one project that I have to open in Project Manager. Obviously, I can't use Project Explorer to open Project Explorer because, you know, there would be issues with classes bumping into each other and so on. So I have actually switched for the more than a year now. I've been using Project Explorer exclusively instead of the Project Manager because, you know, I believe in eating my own dog food. So, which is kind of disgusting, but I use Project Explorer exclusively, except for Project Explorer itself. This is the one thing that I have to open in Project Manager. So you'll notice that all of the classes here start with Project Explorer something. Almost all, not quite, but every VCX starts with Project Explorer. Almost every class starts with Project Explorer. It makes a lot of the names really long, as you can see. But there's a reason for that. And it's the same reason why, if you take a look at the source code for Thor, Jim Nelson uses, I think it's base controls or something like that, or Thor base controls, or whatever name he's using for his base classes as well. And the reason for that is because these are tools that you use in the Fox Pro development environment, and you're going to have other classes and other forms and so on open. And these classes are sort of loaded into memory because the app is loaded into memory. So it's really easy to have name collisions in that case. If I had called this mycontrols.vcx, for example, and you have a VCX named mycontrols, when you open mycontrols, some class in mycontrols, when you're using Project Explorer, it might open my class, not yours. So, or you might get an error message because it can't open it. So I wanted to avoid name collisions, so that's why I named almost everything with a prefix of Project Explorer, assuming that you're not naming yours Project Explorer something, which I consider to be pretty unlikely. All right, so let's go and take a look at now a very simple overview of the class hierarchy. And I don't expect you to, know this at all. I just wanted to go through sort of an overview. So there is a class, the Project Explorer form class. There's actually a couple of subclasses of it. One for if desktop is turned on, and one if dockable is turned on. But this would be the base class. So the Project Explorer form. It has, through its O solution property, has an instance of the Project Explorer solution class. This is for the solution itself. So this is the form. This represents the solution. Because a solution consists of one or more projects, it has a member called O projects, which is a collection of project engine items. One project engine item per project in the solution. It also has a reference through its O version control member to a version control operations subclass. This is the abstract class. Then there would be one specifically for Git, one for Mercurial, Subversion, whatever, depending on which one you're using. The form also, through its O operations member, has a reference to a project operations object. This does things like build, run, modify, and so on for a particular item by talking directly to the project manager that is open behind the scenes, as we'll see. Anyway, so the project engine, there's one of these for each project in the solution. Obviously, it has multiple items, one for each file, each class, each PRG, and so on. So it has an O project items member. That's a collection of project item classes. Project item is actually an abstract class. There's going to be one of these for each type of item. So project item form is for forms. Project item program is for PRGs. Project item class is for classes, and so on. So this O project items collection has one or more project items, one for each thing in the project. The Project Explorer form actually has a reference through its O project member to the selected project engine. That just saves some having to go, form.osolution.oprojects, item number 1 or 2, whatever, to get at the project object. And same thing through its OItem member has a reference specifically to the item that is selected. Again, it's just a shortcut way. Instead of having to say, this form.osolution.oprojects.item and a certain item, .oproject items, and then a certain item, this, great big long way of getting at it, it can just talk to OItem or OProject to talk to the project or the item directly. The project engine also has a reference to the FoxPro project object. You know that when if you look at _VFP.activeProject, it's an object reference to a project object that has different properties and methods and so on. And so we have a reference to that. As I mentioned, and as I'll show you in code in a couple minutes, the Project Explorer opens the project manager no-show. So it is open, and we can get a reference to that project object. It just isn't visible. And so its OProject member talks to that VFP project object. It also has, through its OProject item member, a reference to this project settings class. I could have put these two together into one class. The only thing that this thing does is it just reads the settings from the project object. Because as I mentioned, that dev info memo field in the PJX file contains things like the author, the company name, the address, and so on. But it's sort of stored in a binary way. And so this class really just reads from and writes to that binary information in the PJX file. Like I said, I could have added these methods to this. I just split it out into a separate object. And so it has a reference through through OProject settings. It has a reference to this settings class, which maintains the settings for the project. This project settings class, though, does have something else, and that is an OServers collection, because you can have more than one COM object inside a project. So for each COM object in this collection, there's going to be an instance of a Project Explorer server object, which simply maintains the properties of your COM servers within a project. So like I said, just a quick overview. I don't expect you to memorize any of this or anything, but let's go and take a look at some actual classes. Again, we're just not going to look at it in any amount of detail, just sort of real quick and dirty. So let's take a look at, let's see, where do we want to start here? Let's go and take a look at project item. As you can see here, this Project Explorer items.VCX contains a bunch of classes that start with project item. This is the abstract class. If we take a look at it, it's got a whole bunch of members. Has can edit. Can this item be edited? So that we know whether the edit button in the Project Explorer form is enabled or not. Can we include it in the project? Can we rename it? Can we remove it? Can we run it? Can we set main? Are there any children for this thing? What's its code page? What are its tags? Does it have a parent or not? Does it have what's the name of its include file? What's its name? What's its key value? When was it last modified? It has, and so on. So all kinds of different, what's its version control status? So a whole bunch of properties about each item that's in that collection, and a bunch of different methods. There's a clone method and an edit item method, an execute file method, new item, remove item, rename item, run item. So all these different methods. A lot of these, though, are abstract methods. Like if we look at run item, there's no code in here, right? Just is an abstract method, because the actual implementation depends on the type of item it is. So this is really an abstract class, and then there are instances of it, subclasses of it, not instances, subclasses of it for each type of file. So the next level down is project item file. This is also an abstract class. This represents anything that is a file, like a form or a label or a class library, but not a class, because a class is not a file, right? A class is essentially a record inside of a VCX. And a field is not a file, it's something inside of a table. So not everything is a subclass of project item file. Things like field and index and class are not, for example, because they are not files. But if we take a look at file and take a look at some of its properties here, we can see, for example, can edit is set to true by default. So normally I can edit a file. Can include is true because I can include a file in a project. I can't include a class in a project, right? I can't include a field in a project. It goes along with the parent, the file itself. Can I remove it? Can I rename it? So some of these properties are set to true here. And we have some of the methods are set here. So for example, run item. It goes and talks to the FoxPro project object and calls, gets the item from it and calls its run method. And the same thing with modify. It goes and calls its edit item here. It goes and calls the modify method of the item inside the project. The next level down would be, for example, the actual implementation. So for a form is represented by project item form. And so it overrides the run method, so it just does a do form. And if we take a look at new item, it either calls modify form or create form from a class, from a specified class and library. So different methods that are overridden here, and might be some properties like can run is set to true. Because you can run a form, but you can't run, say, a DLL. A DLL is a file, but you can't run it. So that's why can run would be false for that, but is true for this. Can set main is false for just about everything except for a PRG and for a form, right? Because those are the only things you can set as main in your project. So these different properties control what behavior you get in Project Explorer, and the other properties control what the settings are for each particular item. Let's go and take a look at the project settings class. This is the one that I mentioned just as a kind of a simple thing. It just reads and writes from the settings for the PJX file. So if we take a look at the get settings method, for example, it opens the project file as a table, and then it calls this method get info setting to decipher excuse me, the binary information in this dev info memo field. So for these things, it gets directly from the project file. The rest of them, it reads from the project object. Like I said, _VFP.ActiveProject, that project object. It's got properties like debug and encrypted and build date time and main file. So we simply write those properties to our own properties, and that way we don't have to be, we can close the project if we have to, because we've grabbed all the values of those properties here. And set settings save settings just the opposite. It writes those values back to the project file. Again, just taking a real quick look at the project engine. There's one of these for each project in the solution. So when we open the project, here we set the data session to 1. Somebody discovered that if we don't set because the Project Explorer runs in its own data session because it opens some tables, and we don't want those to interfere with tables you've got open. So it runs in its own data session. However, if a project has a project hook, and we open the project in the Project Explorer's data session, then when you close the project, you have a dangling data session that even after you've closed Project Explorer, you have a dangling data session. So we have to set data session to 1, then open the project, and then we avoid that issue. So discover that the hard way. Anyway, so if the project's already visible, like if you've said modify project X, then you open up Project Explorer for that same project, obviously we don't want to use the no-show clause. It's already open in that case, and so we'll just sort of remodify it again. But otherwise, by default, we're going to say modify project no wait, no show. No wait, obviously, we don't want to stop things from carrying on. And no show, because we don't want to display the project manager. We want to use it. We just don't want to see it. And then it goes and does a bunch of things like getting the settings, which we saw that method just a moment ago, to go and read those settings from the project. We have to call if there's a project hooked, we have to call its activate method, because that doesn't fire automatically, but we want it to. So when you use no show on a project, the activate method of the project hook doesn't fire. So we'll call it manually. That way we make sure that project hooks are respected. And the only other method we'll take a look in here is get files from project. So this opens up the project as a table, and then it goes through each of the files that are in there. So for each file in the project, we're going to go and add it to the collection. And in the case of some types of files, like class libraries, VCXs, they have things inside them, classes, or in the case of a DVC, it has tables and remote views and connections and so on inside it. And so those are actually lazy loaded. They're not loaded right now, but when you expand a class library for the first time, it goes and reads in the classes for that VCX into the as items in this collection. One last thing to show you is version control. So this version control operations is an abstract class. It has, for example, a commit files method. So there's methods for all the different things you want to do. Renaming a file, reverting a file, bringing up the repository browser, bringing up visual diff, bringing up the revision history, and so on. We take a look at commit files, for example. So it does a bunch of work here. It makes sure that the file names are valid and that their case is properly specified. It does any conversion of binary to, if it's a binary file, it converts it to the text equivalent. But then ultimately, it's going to call this commit files internal method. And if we take a look at that method, it's empty here. And that's because the way you actually commit files differs between Git and Mercurial and Subversion and so on. And so that's why we have to have a subclass, one for Mercurial, one for Git, and you could create ones for other types of version control providers. If we take a look at Mercurial, for example, and we take a look at commit files internal, here's what it does. It's going to do hgcommit -l and the name of a file that contains the commit message. The reason that we use a commit message stored in a file is because it might be longer than 255 characters, which is the maximum command line length. And it may contain illegal DOS characters like, exclamation or commas and pipes and so on, which would not be valid on a command line. And so that's why we're going to write all the commit message to a file and then use that file as the source of the commit message. And then we go and add the names of the files being committed on the command line as well. And then we call run command. And run command uses the late Ed Raw's API app run to go and run it. Rather than using the FoxPro run command, which you don't have any much control over, it uses Ed Raw's API run command to go and execute that command line string to go and tell Mercurial to go and commit these files. All right, so now let's talk about add-ins. The FoxPro Project Manager has project hooks, which I think were added in VFPX if I recall, and they are a way that you can override the behavior of certain events, like when the project is built, when the project is opened, when files are removed, when files are modified. Project Explorer has the idea of add-ins rather than project hooks. They are actually more powerful, easier to create and install, and there's way more events. There's 60 of them compared to the half a dozen that there are for project hooks. We do support project hooks, so if you have a project hook associated with a project, we'll fire off all of the events, so the build event, the modify file event, and so on. Those events all fire, but there are also tons of different add-in events. There's pretty much a before and an after event for just about everything you can think of. So there's a before modify file, after modify file, before remove file, after remove file, before run file, after run file, and so on. The before methods allow you to prevent normal execution. For example, if you return false, that means that the file doesn't get run, either because it shouldn't get run or because you've handled it in some way. Like, for example, somebody asked earlier, can you specify what editor is used for a VCX if you want to use the White Light Computing View Editor Pro, for example? And the answer is yes. Through a add-in that I'll show you in a minute, you can actually specify that rather than using the FoxPro View Editor, you want to use the White Light Computing View Editor Pro instead. So the before modify file event is used to call the view editor and then return false, so that way it doesn't do the normal behavior. In the case of the after, it's already done, so nothing to prevent, but it does allow you to hook into the behavior. So let's go and take a look at how add-ins work. The Project Explorer source code folder has an add-in subdirectory where there's a bunch of pre-built add-ins that have different behavior. Obviously, you can create your own or you can modify these, but these are the ones that come with it. And so here's the one I was just talking about, edit view with viewEditorPro.prg. So let's take a look at, first of all, what an add-in looks like. So it looks like this. It accepts 3 parameters. This is a little template program here. You can put your name here, put your template purpose here, so you just fill in these blanks kind of thing. So I took this inspiration from Thor, which also supports add-ins, and there's sort of 2 calls to it. One of them is a registration call. So if only a single parameter is passed, that means it's being called at startup to find out what you are. So you'll specify, you'll fill in the method property of that parameter, the active property to true or false, indicating whether it's enabled or disabled, optionally a name and the orders. If you have multiple add-ins for a specific method, this allows you to specify what order they're processed in. They're really the only 2 that are really required. Actually, the only one that's really required is this one, telling it what method, before modify file, after modify file, and so on. Then you'll do a return. If p count is more than 1, so if more than 1 parameter is passed, that means it's an actual add-in call, and so you'll specify whatever code that the add-in is supposed to do. So let's go and take a look at the one that we just talked about a minute ago, which is the edit view with view editor. So here the method that we hook into is before modify item. Now I set active to false for all these by default. That way you don't get them kicking in unless you want them to. So you'd set active to true, and then it'll do its thing. So this is the add-in for before modify item. So we check to see if we are a remote view. So if the first parameter being passed is one of those project item objects, its type will be an R for a remote view or an L for a local view. So if this is a view, let's go and read from the registry the location for View Editor Pro. If we found it, like if you don't have View Editor Pro installed, then obviously we can't use it. But if we did find the location and it exists, then we will call it with the item name for the view and the path to the DBC, and we will tell the Project Explorer that the caption of the designer is View Editor Professional. Project Explorer uses a Windows API call to know when you've closed an editor window, right? Because FoxPro doesn't get any events like that itself. When you close a PRG, when you close the class designer, when you close View Editor Professional, FoxPro doesn't get any events. So we use a Windows API function, but we have to know what the caption of that window is. So knowing the caption of the window, we then do bind events to that window. So that way, when it's closed, we can say, okay, now let's go and do something like read its version control status or convert the binary file to a text file and so on. And then we're gonna return false, meaning that we're gonna edit the view using View Editor Professional, and after we're done, we're gonna return false, so that way the normal behavior of bringing up the view designer doesn't execute. Let's go and take a look at this one here. This one is one that Patrick had asked about. How can I control a version number on a build? I don't want to have it automatically increment every time, because that's not the way that I work. I mean, you could, but I don't have that turned on. My version number is a Julian date. The major version number is going to be 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, but my next part of the version number, the minor version number, is the Julian date. So it is the number of days since January 1st of 2000. So for example, right now, my version number is like something like 6972, right? So version 1.6970 is 1.0.6972. The idea being that I can take that date and convert it back again. If I simply add that number to this date, that tells me the date of the build. which is really handy, right? Because I mean, I can't just look at the exe. It may have been, somebody may have just installed it, so it's got today's date on it. So I can't look at the date on the exe to know when the exe was built, but I can look at the version number. Take that number, add it to January 1st of 2000. That tells me when that exe was built, and we use that in the Stonefield query for a bunch of different things, such as, has their software maintenance expired? Are they eligible to upgrade based on what the version number is? So we know what date this build was, and we know when their software maintenance expired. Are they running a legal version or not, for example, or other things? We use this mechanism. Now you can use any mechanism you want to. For example, like Patrick said, maybe the major number is the current year, so 2018, and maybe the minor version is the number of days since January 1st of whatever that year is. Either way, it gives you a number that you can use rather than just being 1, 2, 3, 4. Because I happen to have built it 10 times today as I was testing, I incremented my build number by 10, which kind of looks weird, right? Now it's way beyond what you think it would be. So that's the mechanism I use. So that being said, what I like to have happen is have it, rather than me going and manually changing the build number, I'm going to go and I'm going to set this to active. So this is going to kick into before build project. It's active, so let's save that. And here's what the code is. We're going to go and figure out the number of days since January 1st of 2000, convert it to a 4-digit value, and we're going to change the version number property of the parameter of the object that's passed in to that. So now that I've set this to true, let's go and go to my other instance here. Let's close this and reopen it again because the add-ins are read at startup time. So let's go and take a look at the build number for this. You see it's 1.0.000, right? So let's go and build the project. And notice it automatically changed the build number to 1.0.6734. That is the number of days since January 1st of 2000. So I want that to be my build number whenever I do a build. I don't want to have to go and figure out what the value is, go and expand the dialog, click on the project, click on build settings, manually type that number in. I want it to just do it for me automatically. So that's what that add-in did for us. Let's go and take a look at another one. You'll notice that when I'm sitting on, say, a class and I right-click, this pack file item is disabled, but when I choose it here, it becomes enabled. It does exactly what you think it would do. Because this is a Foxborough binary file, it will just essentially go use sfcontrols.vcx, pack, and then close it again. So it just compacts that file. Now, this menu item is not part of Project Explorer. This doesn't come out of the box with Project Explorer. So what's it doing there in the menu? Because I didn't put it there. Well, I sort of did. I put it in there because it's here in this add-in. Add pack to shortcut menu. Let's go and take a look at that. So the method it's keyed into is after create shortcut menu. So the shortcut menu has been created. After it's been created, but before it's been displayed, let's go and do something. I'm going to leave this set at false for a second. Here's the code that actually executes, though. The first thing that's passed in is a reference to the form. It has an add menu bar, a reference to the menu. It has an add menu bar method. The first parameter is the text to display in the menu. The second parameter is the command to execute. So here we're going to go and do whatever my main folder is, addin/function/pack file. So it's just going to run a little PRG in the add-ins in the functions subdirectory, passing it the path for the selected item. So in other words, the name of the VCX. It'll use a skip for clause. That's the next parameter. A skip for clause of if we don't have an item selected, or if it's not a binary file, like if it's a PRG, if it's a class, if it's a DLL, something like that, then in that case, it's not a binary file, so we don't have anything to pack. So this is our skip for clause. The next parameter, which there's nothing being passed, is the image to use in the menu. And the last item is where in the menu does it go. 3 means it's going to be the third item in the menu. And so that's how we get this pack file as the third item in the menu. That's disabled unless we're sitting on a VFP binary file. But wait a second. It's in the menu, and yet, where's my, there it is. And yet active is set to false. How come? Well, the reason for that is because there's actually another folder here. There's a my add-in subdirectory. Because the problem is, if you go and change this, let's go and edit this again. If I go and change this to true, and I've cloned the repository, now the file has changed. For example, you notice I did that for set version number, right? Because we set that to true, it's now a modified file. So if I go and pull from the repository, it's going to see that there are differences between these two, and it's going to ask me to have to merge them and deal with them and so on. So rather than having to deal with that hassle, just because you want to make an add-in true, there is this My Add-ins folder. It doesn't exist by default, but if you create a folder called My Add-ins and you put a project or an add-in in there and you make this one true, right? Then it will override the one that's in the add-ins folder with the one in the My Add-ins folder, and this one will be true. That's why, even though this one is set to active false, this one is set to active true, and therefore the add-in does kick in. Here's one that I use literally 100 times a day. After create menu, it adds a menu bar called run main program. It executes this code. So it runs the item, and the item that it runs is whatever the main file is in the project. If I don't have a main file, like if I've got a project and nothing has main files true, then obviously we're going to disable this item. There's no image, and I want it to be the second last item in the menu. So if we go and take a look at, now this is not after create shortcut menu. That would be the shortcut menu. This is after create menu, which is the main menu. So let's make this one true. And let's go and close Project Explorer and reopen it again. And now in the main menu, there's a new item, the second last one, because that's where I told to go, called Run Main Program. Now, why is this a feature I use 100 times a day? Because I'm making changes to a class, right? I'm editing this class here. Then now I want to run the application to see if my changes worked. But in order to do that, I'd have to go, to choose my tag, go to code, scroll down through my 150 PRGs, find the one that's a main one, and then go and run it. Then when the program is done, I come back to Project Explorer, I go back to the classes tag, and it does remember the last used class, so I can at least stick to there. But then I have to go, now I want to run it again, I have to go back to code, it's already still selected, so I can just go and run it. That's a pain to have to do that 100 times a day. Instead, even though I'm sitting on the classes tab, or the classes tag here, I just go and say run main program. It goes and executes the main program, does whatever, and then when it finishes, I'm still on the classes tag, still with the same selected item. I can go and modify it and make a couple more tweaks, run it again, a couple more tweaks, run it again, back and forth until I'm done, I'm on to the next thing. So I don't ever have to go to that code tab, scroll way down to find that startup PRG and then execute it. So like I said, this is something I use 100 times a day, choosing this run main program. All right, so then there's a whole bunch of other add-ins here. For example, there's the White Light Computing has a project builder, so you can add the project builder button to your toolbar. There is get add-ins on activate. If we make this one true, then we don't actually have to close Project Explorer whenever we've changed another add-in. We just have to sort of click away from it and click back onto it, and boom, it rereads all of the add-ins, and so it automatically sees that there are some new ones there. Pack files after cleanup, we've already seen that one. Set font, this one goes and changes the font. So if we take a look at this one is on startup. So if we make it true, we can set the default font to 12 instead of 9, is what it is. And you can change the font name to something else. So it's just a way of changing the font. And so on. So there's a bunch of different add-ins. Some of them are just demos, like test before save project item, test run item. It just displays a message box. You know, when you run the item, it just displays a message box that you are running the item. So some of them are just for demo purposes. Some of them are actually useful. So they're all described in the documentation. Now, how do you register an add-in? Do you have to do like some kind of registration process? No, you simply drop it in the add-ins folder. End of story. So just the fact that it's a PRG that exists in here, that's all that's required. Obviously, you have to, accept 3 parameters. You have to have some code that executes. But when Project Explorer starts up, it looks at its own add-in subdirectory, enumerates through the PRGs, calls them by passing 1 parameter, and if it doesn't get a value back, it does it in a try clause and a try structure. If it doesn't get a reasonable value back, then it knows that it wasn't really an add-in PRG. Otherwise, it is an add-in PRG, and it adds it to a little cursor. So it knows about all the different add-ins that are available. So that's what I said what I meant in the slide, that they are easier to create. It's just a PRG as opposed to having to, create a subclass of the project hook class and then put some code into a method and then going to the project manager and associating the project hook with that project. Here it's just a PRG, you drop in a folder and you're done. So they're easier to create and they're easier to install, and they're more powerful because you can change the UI, you can change the behavior, you can do just about anything with an add-in that you can't do with a project hook. All right, so we'll wind up and then we'll take some questions. So Project Explorer overcomes a lot of the project manager's shortcomings and adds a lot of behavior that you maybe even never thought you needed, like Mike's suggestion about that new class dialog, where it's so easy to subclass a class now. You just right-click the class and the dialog's already filled in for you. I welcome your feedback. That's how Mike made that suggestion, was going to GitHub and on the issues tab, just creating an issue there. It's better than email. I mean, I do accept emails obviously as well, but issues on GitHub are better because that way other people can see them, we can keep track of them, and so on. So it's just a better mechanism for collaboration with there. All right, so any questions? I think everybody is unmuted, so you can either ask me a question if you have a microphone, or you can type it, and we can take a look at it there. Oh, so there are some questions here. Some of them are actually kind of old. I guess I wasn't keeping up here. So how about a date time appended to the auto commit message? Absolutely, you could do that just by changing the message. I think it uses, I know it actually uses, if we go into here, it actually uses text merge on it. So you notice, for example, the auto commit message is build the project version and then the version number here as text merge. So if you wanted to put a date time, we could say on, so just put it in curly braces, some Fox Pro function or some property or something like that, and then it will, excuse me, it will automatically add that to the auto commit message. Let's see what else. Version control properties. Let's see. Would you recommend migrating existing project hook functionality to Project Explorer add-ins? For example, I use a hook to email team members when a new file is added to a project. No need to. I mean, you could, but I mean, if you've got a project hook and the project hook is associated with the project, then it'll automatically fire that project hook whenever a new file is added or whenever a build is done. Whatever your project hook is doing, it will execute that project hook code. So no need to take the time to do an add-in, but you could as well. So your call. And that's it for questions so far. So like I said, you can either use your microphone and ask a question, or you can, somebody else did have a question here. Let's see. Oh, it's just a thank you. You're welcome. Oh, it was Kenneth from Puerto Rico, so glad you could make it. Actually, yeah, we had one person from Puerto Rico. We have one person from China, and I don't know what other countries are here. I think that's
That's
it
awesome.
for non North American folks. All right. So, any questions or anything else?
Yeah, I think I